Naomi and Kyra had been dreaming of this moment for weeks. Two teenage sisters, dressed in their very best, stepping into first class for the very first time. But instead of the smiles and respect they expected, they were met with glares, whispers, and then something far worse. It started small, an attendant's sharp tone, a smirk from nearby passengers. But within minutes, it escalated into humiliation so deep it cut through their pride. A public scene in front of dozens of strangers, where their very right to sit in the seats they paid for was questioned, mocked and nearly stripped away. Imagine being 16 or 17, finally stepping into a place you've earned, only to be treated like you don't belong, because of the color of your skin. The cabin went silent. Passengers turned their heads. Some muttered under their breath, others shook their heads in quiet disapproval. But no one spoke up for Naomi and Kyra. No one dared to challenge the injustice unraveling right before their eyes. Naomi clutched her boarding pass, her hands trembling. Kyra leaned closer and whispered, "Don't cry. Don't let them see you cry." But the humiliation only grew heavier. Every word, every stare, every accusation felt like the world pressing down on them, and then something unexpected happened. Naomi reached for her phone, not to scroll, not to text, but to make one call, just one. On the other end was a voice they knew well, their father, Jabari. Calm, steady, powerful. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to threaten. He simply listened as his daughters, through broken voices, told him what had just happened. What happened next stunned everyone. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the plane shifted. The same crew members who had barked orders now froze. The same passengers who had watched in silence now looked around nervously. Because somehow, with one phone call, Jabari had done something no one thought possible. The plane didn't move. Engines idled. Doors stayed closed. And then whispers spread. Every flight is being delayed. The entire airline is on hold. Two teenage girls, once humiliated, now sat at the center of something far bigger than themselves. Their father's influence, his power, had forced the entire system to stop, if only for a moment. But what exactly did Jabari say? How could a single phone call freeze an entire airline, grounding planes across the sky? And more importantly, why did this man, who appeared to be just a devoted father, wield such hidden power? This is not just a story about Naomi and Kyra. It's about dignity stolen and dignity reclaimed. It's about a father who refused to let the world break his children. Stay with me, because what unfolds next will not only shock you, but it will also reveal a truth about justice, power, and the cost of silence. Naomi and Kyra weren't just sisters, they were best friends. Born only a year apart, they grew up sharing clothes, secrets, and even dreams. At home they were inseparable. Their laughter filled the small house. Their music spilled into the streets, and their father, Jabari, often said they were his greatest pride. Naomi, the older one, was the quiet storm, calm, observant but fierce when pushed. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, never raising her voice but always commanding attention when she spoke. Kyra, on the other hand, was full of fire. Bold, witty, and unafraid to speak her mind, she could turn any situation into a stage for her sharp humor. Together they balanced each other perfectly. School had never been easy for them. They were smart, hard-working, and ambitious, but they had already felt the sting of whispers. The subtle jokes that weren't really jokes. The teachers who doubted their abilities before even reading their work. But through it all, they had one anchor, Jabari. Jabari was no ordinary father. To Naomi and Kyra, he was a protector, a mentor, and the kind of man who carried quiet authority everywhere he went. He never raised his voice, but his words always carried weight. At family dinners, he would remind his daughters, "The world will try to tell you where you don't belong. Don't let it. Walk in like you were meant to be there." So when Naomi and Kyra received their first-class tickets, a gift for excelling at school, they saw it not just as a flight, but as a symbol. A symbol of everything Jabari had taught them. They did belong. They could walk into any room, sit in any seat, and claim what was rightfully theirs. The morning of the flight was filled with excitement. Kyra spent hours choosing her outfit, settling on a bright yellow dress that matched her bold spirit. Naomi chose a simple, elegant blouse and jeans, comfortable but classy. They giggled as they packed their bags, snapping selfies, sending messages to friends. First class, can you believe it? At the airport, everything felt magical. The sisters moved through the terminal with wide eyes, marveling at the towering glass walls, the gleaming shops, the endless rows of planes. It felt like stepping into another world, a world they had always dreamed of. But in the corners of that dream, shadows lurked. A few sideways glances, a couple of whispers, a security guard's stare that lingered just a little too long. Naomi noticed. Kyra brushed it off. They were used to it. Still, nothing could have prepared them for what was waiting inside the cabin of that plane, because soon, their dream would shatter, and their father's voice would become the only thing standing between humiliation and justice. Naomi and Kyra stepped into the first-class cabin with their tickets gripped tightly. Their hearts raced, not from fear but from excitement. Plush leather seats, wide aisles, soft lighting, it was everything they had imagined. For a moment, the world felt perfect. But the first crack in that perfection came swiftly. A flight attendant blocked their path, her smile forced, her voice coated with skepticism. "Excuse me, young ladies," she said, eyeing them up and down. "First class is this way. Economy is further back." Naomi's brow furrowed. "We know," she replied softly, holding out her boarding pass. The attendant didn't take it immediately. Instead, she tilted her head, as if waiting for the girls to admit some mistake. Passengers turned to watch. Some raised eyebrows, others smirked. Kyra felt heat rise in her cheeks. She pushed the pass forward. "Here, look, seat 3A and 3B. Finally, the attendant took it. She scanned the tickets, her expression tightening, like she'd been proven wrong, but hated it. "Well, all right, but keep your voices down. First class is quiet," the word stung. It wasn't just instruction, it was dismissal. Naomi's chest tightened, but she forced a smile. They took their seats, determined not to let one person ruin this. Yet the whispers started immediately. Two men across the aisle exchanged a look. A woman leaned toward her husband and muttered, "First class isn't what it used to be." Another passenger coughed a laugh, shaking his head. Kyra gripped her armrest, anger burning. Naomi whispered, "Ignore them, just ignore it." But ignoring became impossible. Minutes later, the same attendant returned, her tone sharper. "Excuse me, are you sure you're in the right place?" "These seats are very expensive." Naomi froze. "We already showed you our tickets." "Yes, well," the attendant sniffed. "Sometimes people mix things up." The humiliation spread like fire. Passengers leaned in, some openly watching, others pretending to look away but listening closely. Kyra snapped, "We didn't mix anything up." "We belong here." The attendant's lips tightened. "Watch your tone, young lady." A man in a suit chuckled. "Kids these days." "No respect." Kyra's fists clenched. Naomi felt tears threaten her eyes, but she held them back. Not here. Not in front of them. The attendant walked away, but the damage was done. The cabin buzzed with judgment. Every laugh, every side glance cut deeper. Then came the final blow. A supervisor appeared, clipboard in hand. "Ladies, I need to verify your tickets again," she said. Her voice was polite but firm, too firm. "Please stand up." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted in their seats, eager for the spectacle. Naomi rose slowly, her hands trembling. Kyra followed, glaring at the supervisor with defiance. They handed over their passes, again. The supervisor studied them for what felt like an eternity, her frown deepening. These appear to be correct, but how did you obtain them?" The implication hung heavy. Naomi whispered, "Our father gave them to us." "Is there a problem?" The supervisor raised her brows. "First-class tickets like these don't usually end up in the hands of teenagers." "Are you sure they're not what?" Kyra demanded. "Mistaken or fraudulent?" The word fraudulent sliced through the air. A passenger gasped. Someone else chuckled. Naomi's face burned with shame. Kyra shouted, "We didn't steal these tickets." "Call our dad right now!" The supervisor folded her arms. "Maybe we should. Until then, I'll have to ask you to step aside." The sisters stood there, humiliated, as the first-class passengers stared. Some looked disgusted, some amused, others quietly supportive but silent. Naomi felt her knees weaken. She thought of Jabari's words. Walk in like you belong. But right now it felt like the entire world was telling them they didn't. She reached for her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed. Kyra whispered, "Call him, Naomi. Call Dad." The line rang. Once, twice. Then, "Hello?" Jabari's deep, steady voice filled her ear. Naomi's voice cracked. "Dad, they're saying we don't belong here. They won't let us stay." Jabari's silence stretched for a beat. Then his tone hardened, calm but powerful. "Put me on speaker." Naomi obeyed. His voice filled the cabin. "This is Jabari. You have exactly 30 seconds to explain why my daughters are being harassed in front of your passengers, despite having legitimate tickets." The supervisor blinked, caught off guard. The attendant shifted nervously. Passengers leaned closer. Jabari continued, his voice growing sharper. "Because if you can't explain, then I will. And trust me, you don't want the world hearing it from me." A hush fell over the cabin. Naomi and Kyra looked at each other, hope flickering in their eyes for the first time since boarding. The supervisor stammered, Sir, I was only following protocol." Jabari cut in. "Protocol doesn't include humiliating young black women who have every right to be there. Fix this, now, or I make one more phone call, and this airline won't be flying anywhere today." The entire plane froze. Passengers exchanged shocked looks. The attendants paled. Naomi's heart pounded. Could their father really do that? Could one phone call change everything? And then the supervisor stepped back, flustered. But the damage was done. The girls had been scarred, humiliated. The question now wasn't whether they belonged. It was how far their father's influence would reach and what the airline would face once Jabari made his next move. The cabin was still. Engines hummed in the background, but inside the plane you could hear every breath, every whisper. Naomi and Kyra stood frozen in the aisle, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing down on them. The supervisor still clutched their boarding passes, her lips trembling as Jabari's voice thundered through the speakerphone. "You've humiliated my daughters long enough," Jabari said. His voice steady but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "And now you will answer for it." The attendant shifted nervously. The supervisor cleared her throat. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? Jabari snapped. His calm was gone. His words now carried fire. "A misunderstanding doesn't make my girls stand in the aisle like criminals while your passengers laugh. A misunderstanding doesn't mean asking the same children to prove themselves again and again. That isn't policy. That's prejudice," gasps rippled through the cabin. A few passengers turned their heads in shame. Others still smirked, but uneasily now, their amusement cracking under the weight of Jabari's fury. Naomi's heart pounded. Her father's voice had always been her anchor, but tonight it sounded like something else. Like a force no one could ignore. Kyra finally found her own voice. She stepped forward, her fists clenched. "We paid for these tickets. We didn't steal them. We belong here. And you're not going to treat us like we don't." The words rang out, sharp and defiant. A hush fell again. For the first time that night, the power shifted. The sisters weren't just victims anymore. They were fighters. The supervisor stammered, We didn't mean any harm." But Jabari's voice thundered again. "Harm has already been done. Now let me make this clear. If my daughters aren't treated with the dignity they deserve, not one plane will leave this runway tonight." The words landed like an earthquake. Naomi glanced around. Passengers exchanged stunned looks. A businessman muttered, "Is he serious?" A mother clutched her child closer. The flight crew stiffened, panic flickering in their eyes. Naomi whispered to Kyra, "Dad can't actually stop the planes, right?" But Kyra's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "You don't know Dad like I do." The supervisor tried to regain control. "Sir, please, threats are not necessary." "This isn't a threat," Jabari cut in coldly. "It's a promise." Then almost on cue, a crackle came over the captain's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received word of a sudden delay affecting all flights across the airline. Please remain seated until further notice." The cabin erupted. Murmurs surged into shouts. "What? All flights? What's happening?" The sisters stood there, eyes wide. Naomi clutched her chest, her breath shallow. Could it be true? Could one phone call from Jabari have frozen the entire airline? The supervisor's face drained of color. She glanced at the attendants, then at Naomi and Kyra, her lips parting in shock. Jabari's voice cut through again, softer this time, but more dangerous for it. You see? My daughters are not alone. They never were. And the longer you humiliate them, the worse this gets for you. Naomi's knees trembled. For a moment, she thought she might collapse. But then Kyra reached out, grabbed her hand and whispered, "Stand tall. Dad's right. We belong here." And so they did. Shoulder to shoulder, two sisters stood their ground in the heart of first class, no longer shrinking, no longer silent. The humiliation hadn't broken them. It had revealed their strength. Passengers whispered nervously. Some looked at Naomi and Kyra with new respect, others with shame. But no one laughed anymore. No one dared. Finally, the supervisor's voice cracked. Please take your seats. You'll remain here, in first class where you belong." The words were forced, bitter, but they were victory. Naomi and Kyra sat down, their hearts still pounding, the silence around them deafening. The phone on Naomi's lap still glowed. Jabari's voice came one last time, low and steady. "I told you my daughters don't walk alone. Remember that." And then he hung up. The cabin remained frozen, everyone processing what had just happened. The sisters exchanged a glance, their eyes glassy with tears but burning with pride. They had been humiliated. They had been doubted, mocked, nearly broken. But in that moment, they were something more than passengers. They were proof. Proof that dignity couldn't be taken. Not when you had the courage to fight for it, and not when you had a father who would shake the world to protect you. The climax had passed. But the aftermath, the consequences, were only just beginning. The cabin was quiet. Naomi and Kyra sat back in their seats, their hearts still racing. Around them, silence replaced laughter. Judgmental stares melted into shame. The same passengers who once watched their humiliation now sat uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their luxury seats. The humiliation had ended, but its echo lingered. Naomi's hands trembled in her lap. Kyra leaned back, arms crossed, still fuming. She whispered, "They thought they could push us out like we don't belong." "But Dad showed them." Naomi nodded, but her chest still ached. Even with the victory, the scars of those moments would remain. She knew she would never forget the way the attendant's eyes looked at her, like she was less than human. The flight resumed. Drinks were served, trays clinked, conversations picked back up. But the energy in first class had shifted. Naomi and Kyra no longer felt invisible. Every movement from the staff was cautious now, calculated. Respect had been forced upon them, not freely given, but wrestled from prejudice. Hours later, when the plane finally landed, something extraordinary happened. A quiet murmur rose in the cabin. A few passengers, those who had sat silently through the humiliation, approached the sisters. One older woman placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder and whispered, "I should have said something." "I'm sorry." Another man, voice low, muttered, "The way they treated you was wrong. You deserved better. It wasn't much. It didn't erase the pain, but it was proof. Silence could be broken. Change began when people found the courage to speak, even if it was late. Outside the plane, reporters swarmed. Somehow word had spread. Phones had recorded the confrontation, snippets of Jabari's voice carried online, igniting a storm. Headlines began to flash. Teen sisters humiliated in first class. Father's phone call grounds airline flights. Airline under fire for discrimination scandal. By the time Naomi and Kyra walked through the terminal, their story had already gone viral. The world was watching, and for once, that weight didn't crush them. It lifted them. At home, Jabari embraced his daughters tightly, his calm eyes burning with pride. "You did well," he said softly. "You stood tall. Remember this moment, not because of the pain, but because of your courage." In the weeks that followed, the fallout was massive. The airline issued a public apology. The attendants involved were suspended pending investigation. Diversity and inclusion policies were rewritten overnight, not out of choice, but out of necessity. The world was watching, and silence was no longer an option. But beyond policies, beyond press conferences, something more meaningful shifted. Naomi and Kyra's story reached families across the globe. Parents sat their children down to talk about dignity, about racism, about speaking out. Communities rallied, holding conversations about prejudice that had been buried too long. The sisters were invited to speak at schools, to share their story, to inspire others never to accept humiliation in silence. Naomi, once soft-spoken, found her voice in front of audiences. Kyra, fiery and bold, became a fighter not just for herself but for others. One night, as they sat at the dinner table with Jabari, Naomi whispered, "Dad, I don't think I'll ever forget what happened." Jabari placed a steady hand over hers. "You're not supposed to forget. Pain isn't meant to be erased. It's meant to teach. And what it taught you is this: racism destroys families, prejudice weakens communities. But courage? Courage defeats hate." Kyra nodded, her eyes fierce. "And unity brings healing." The three of them sat there in silence, understanding the truth of it. The scars would remain, but so would the strength. Because in the end, the story of Naomi and Kyra wasn't just about humiliation on a plane. It was about a turning point. A moment when prejudice was exposed, when silence was broken, and when a family's courage forced the world to stop and listen. And the lesson was clear. Dignity must never be begged for. It must be claimed. So the next time someone whispers, someone doubts, someone tries to push another human being into the shadows, perhaps they'll remember Naomi and Kyra. Perhaps they'll remember Jabari's voice, calm, steady, unshakable. And perhaps they'll choose courage, because courage always defeats hate.